Well, good morning, everyone. I am John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and for this year, we are celebrating the cultural and geographic regions in the United States. And for week 2 of the lecture series, we'll explore the 49th and 50th states. We're fortunate to have Michelle Nickerson today. Michelle is an author and professor of history at Loyola University of Chicago. She currently serves on the American Women's History Museum Committee of Scholars. And Michelle's presentation, Gulags in Alaska, The Strange History of a Cold War Conspiracy Theory, will examine a 1956 episode that was part of a rise of populist currents in American conservatism. We hope you can join us for the rest of the week as we learn more about Alaska and Hawaii. And also today is the final day that the Traveling Vietnam Wall will be here in Lakeside. It's on the waterfront west of the Hotel Lakeside, between Hotel Lakeside and Oak. And I do encourage you, if you have some time in the day, to go down and see it if you haven't had a chance to experience it. And then also I do ask you, please mute your cell phone ringers if you haven't already, and help me in welcoming Michelle Nickerson.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Very good. Okay, great. Before I get started, I want to say thank you to John Mann for extending this wonderful invitation. Also to Jeanette and Jim Keaton for hosting me and for connecting me with your community. And to Mike back there, who's handling the technology. I'm so grateful that I could join you today on this beautiful day, and that you're here with me, because I am really animated by this topic and these stories that I'm going to introduce to you, and I don't get to tell them very often. So you may know that scholars, when we teach and write, we're kind of forced into these niches, these specializations. And even Jeanette today, we were talking about this, and you didn't even know my background in this area. Most people don't realize that Alaska is the place where I started my professional career as a historian before I went to graduate school. It was a place that actually made me want to go to graduate school and to study history further. Eventually, my track veered away from Alaska, and you're going to see why and how in a little bit. But there's so much to talk about, and another thing about it that makes me so excited is that the story that I started with, this conspiracy theory, it was after I wrote about it in my first book, Mothers of Conservatism. Other people took it in other directions, and some of them went back to the story of Alaska. And so now I get to take that material that's been developed since I wrote my stuff and talk to you about it. So without further ado, let me just start by saying, all right, Gulag, what is this? So in 1956, in the height of Cold War anti-communism and the Red Scare, there was a conspiracy theory that circulated and got significant traction and became disruptive. It wasn't a conspiracy theory, I would say, that circulated in the general public, but it circulated in a small and growing contingent of anti-communist activists, people who were very fearful of the Cold War. You might even say conservatives, except at that point in time, in 1956, people didn't call themselves conservatives yet. It was only a small group of intellectuals who were getting that word going. But in my book, I talk about this conspiracy theory as an origin point for the American conservative movement, okay? But it's all based on ideas about Alaska. So, how many of you have been to Alaska? Great, yes. So I'm guessing some of you have been through the Inside Passage, maybe Anchorage. Not many people get all the way up onto the North Slope, but you probably have some familiarity with it. The geography here. That's me back in 1994. I was a park ranger. And I was hired by the Park Service as a seasonal ranger. That meant that I was only there for 4 months, and my job was to, if anybody come through on a cruise ship, how many people came through Sitka? Okay, I was one of the park rangers at the Sitka historic sites. And so I was given kind of a boot camp introduction to the history before people would come off the boats on their tenders and walk through the Russian bishop's house and the visitor center. But then the park historian said, it's your job to create your story. You need to develop your own lectures. Here are the archives. Here are some books. Put together your own presentation, which was very scary, but it made sense after a while, because when you give 4 or 5 tours a day, you can't tell the same script anymore. You lose your mind. And so I had the opportunity to kind of develop this expertise in the area of Alaskan history and American history. And so there I was in Sitka, and I became very familiar with certain stories about Alaska. The history of Alaskan natives, the settlement by the Russians, the settlement by the Americans. And so before I go further, I just want to get a sense, if anybody's willing to tell me, what stories do you remember hearing from your visit? What stands out when you hear History of Alaska? Yes, sir.
The poems by Robert Service.
Oh, wow, okay.
They read them on the train as we went from Anchorage to Denali.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, Robert
Jeanette.
Service.
The biggest impression was pictures of the receding glacier.
Oh.
I can't remember which glacier it was.
Glacier National Park?
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was pictures taken 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s.
Yeah.
And it was scary.
It is, yeah. Anybody else? So when most people encounter Alaska and Alaska history, it's often in terms of natural history, like what's changing about the landscape, but also Native Alaskan history, because it is so rich, but also the Russian-American history, because it's an important moment of colonization in the 19th century and European Christian settlement. But what I've come to know is how much of Alaska today is shaped by the Cold War, the American Cold War. What happens during first World War II and then the years immediately after World War II. And it's a really interesting way to think about the tensions between remoteness and wilderness, and the way we think about these concepts, and where Alaska as a place, it's a place where these ideas kind of inhabit spaces, but also to think about this place that's cut off from the contiguous states, what Alaskans refer to as the lower 48, and a global and international place, which is what it's increasingly becoming after World War II. Alaska, until 1959, is a territory. And most of what I'm going to start with here is to tell you what that was like and what it meant for people living there, and then how that changed. So you're getting a few overlapping stories here. So in the night, I wish I had a better image, sorry. The US military called Alaska in the years that are concerning us here, the feverish 50s, because of the rate of growth. And just I'm going to just throw some numbers at you to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Of the $500 million economy, which is not huge, $350 million of those dollars came from the US military. The population went from 25,000 people in 1947 to 48,000 people in 1957. And, excuse me, that's the military population. The civilian population shot up in those years from 83,000 people to 180,000 people. So you have this place that's drawing people mainly from the lower 48, but also foreign countries, especially Sweden, Finland, but it's nevertheless not a state, and that's complicated. And so that brings us then to this problem of healthcare and psychiatric care, which is really the heart of the story I'm going to talk about. So people who grew up in Alaska around this time, many of them remember this saying: once you grow up, you either stay inside, you go outside, or you go to Morningside. Inside meant you stayed in Alaska. Outside meant you moved to Chicago or somewhere else. Morningside meant you went to the Morningside Psychiatric Facility in Portland, Oregon. And maybe you came back, maybe you didn't, okay? But it held this place in the Alaskan imagination as the place where you were sent if something went wrong. For a lot of kids, that meant if you didn't behave, if you estranged yourself. And there was something very real about this, because since Alaska did not have a mental health facility, any patient had to go to Oregon. And so let me tell you what that involved. Okay, this is Morningside Hospital in Portland. At that point, it was a private hospital. It was owned by a family, the Coes. And they got about $800,000 a year in the mid-50s to take patients from Alaska. The federal government had to pay that because Alaska was a federal territory. And so let's say you were 85 years old and suffering from dementia, or you were 7 years old and your parents couldn't control you, or let's say you were legitimately suffering from a mental health condition. They would, in your town or your district, they would convene a jury of 8 men, okay? It was always 8 white men who would then decide whether you needed to go to an asylum or not. So they were not doctors. And then a US Marshal, let's say you were deemed insane, would take you to a temporary facility while you were waiting to get your diagnosis or this ruling from the jury. You would be held in a jail, even if you were 7, and then you would have to be transported to a port. So that would either happen by dog sled, or maybe there were roads to take you there. Somehow someone had to get you to the coast, hundreds of miles. And then you would fly to Portland. And we're talking thousands of miles. So it could take weeks, especially if the airline, which had the right to do so, would say, we are not going to take an insane, dangerous person on our plane. So then authorities would have to put you on a boat and take you to Morningside Hospital in Portland. And so you can imagine what an ordeal this was. And so many people suffered. And I'll get into the numbers of that a little bit later on, because there is a better ending to this story. Over the years, advocates in the federal government and beyond knew about this and they were horrified. So as early as 1915, James Wickersham, who was a representative to Congress, of course he didn't have any voting rights, brought attention to this because there was a detention hospital in Fairbanks, and there were these other jails, and he said, we can't do this. This is barbaric. But then really by the 1950s, as the Cold War is bringing more attention to Alaska, these two representatives were able to have some success. So Edith Green was in the House of Representatives and Bob Bartlett in the Senate. So as delegates, they could not vote, but they could advance, they could propose legislation and get support for it. So first, Edith Green begins to expose the horrors of everything that I just told you about. And she brought the attention of this problem to fellow members of Congress. And then Bob Bartlett was even more assertive about it. And he said, this cannot continue. And Bartlett was a very strong advocate for statehood. And this issue itself is going to propel statehood further into the priorities of Congress at this time. So 1956, he proposes the Alaska Mental Health Enabling Act. And it starts to make its way through Congress, and it's really quite successful. Another reason for this was because mental health, even that word itself as a concept, is becoming part of the American vernacular, and people are taking more of an interest in mental health. So the word itself, in my research, I found that it derives way back to the early part of the 20th century. But it really wasn't in circulation. People weren't using that word. People understood, they knew what psychology was as a field, they knew who Freud was. Some people got treatment, but treatment for mental health problems wasn't really part of the American public health system the way it is today. That changes for a couple of reasons. Also, World War II and the Cold War. Because during World War II, many American soldiers suffered psychological conditions. I know I'm not telling you anything new in that respect. And they had been, of course, since World War I and shell shock. This time, though, the federal government, in all of its spending for the war, hired many psychiatric professionals to actually go to combat zones and treat soldiers. One of the most important figures in this was a doctor by the name of William Menninger, okay? And so he and other doctors developed a specialization in treating trauma and bringing care right to soldiers. And in the process, in those combat zones, soldiers got very comfortable with receiving mental health care. And it became less of a stigma to accept it, to talk to a therapist, and to imagine themselves as part of a recovery and coming back to life through mental health care. So they returned home at the end of the war, and they start demanding these services. And so VA hospitals begin to institutionalize mental health care as a priority. And there's a very important piece of legislation that's passed that makes mental health care a priority for the rest of the country. And this transition, historians talk about this as an important transition from the treatment of mental illness to the promotion of mental health. The National Mental Health Act is passed in 1946 because of all these developments that I talked about. Between 1950 and 1957, the NIMH budget jumped from $8.7 million to $315 million, just to give you a sense of what changed. And so people start using that word mental health to talk about health. Also, doctors prioritize the movement of people out of psychiatric facilities and asylums into a more localized form of mental health treatment at centers in people's communities. Okay, so with that happening kind of in the background, that's where Edith Green starts talking about, like, hello, look at us in Alaska. It's so barbaric here. Do you see what's happening to us? And people are starting to notice. And then that's when Bob Bartlett gets on the train and says, all right, we're going to make this happen. I know enough people. And that's what happened in 1956. But there's another development in ideas about mental health that's also going to be familiar to you. And that's the concept of brainwashing. That's another word that people did not use before 1952. Because this notion, so you all know what that word means. During the Korean War, American GIs who were captured were sent to re-education camps where Chinese doctors used psychological methods to try and train their minds and basically turn them into communists, make them friendly. And Americans first learned about it through a series of books. There was one called Brainwashing in Red China, not this book here, but it was a book produced by an actual professional, a doctor. And that book appeared in 1951. And the author of that was a man by Edward Hunter. And then a psychologist, Joost Meerlo, from Scandinavia, created a kind of social scientific niche within his field to understand and talk about what was happening in China and Korea. And then anti-communists started to notice this, and they began to understand it, brainwashing, as something that communists did to make people into communists. So this is still 1950, kind of the early years of the Cold War, and people are afraid of communism, and they're especially afraid of how it spreads. Because communists in the Soviet Union especially had an international understanding of communism. But then along with that was this fear of what was called the fifth column. The idea that communism spread by planting agents within a country like the United States and spreading ideas secretly through brainwashing. And so as people inside and outside of government, people like Andrew McCarthy, no, not Andrew McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, Senator Joseph McCarthy, the House Un-American Activities Committee, were hunting Reds within the government. There were Americans, private citizens, who were looking for communists in their midst. Like, they thought that they were in their schools. They were convinced that elites at American universities were adopting communistic thinking and spreading them among their students. So brainwashing became a handle, a way of understanding this process of indoctrination. Now, I'm giving you a little sneak peek here of a talk I'm going to give later in this summer about my book. Because the Mothers of Conservatism, this is one of the ones that I happen to talk to, this was a movement of mostly American housewives starting in the 1950s who adopted anti-communism as almost like a scholarly and political activity. They saw it as their job to find those people in their communities. And when I talk later in the summer, I'll get into more details about how they did that exactly. But they came to believe that when they saw something happening in their local schools among their children, that they saw something sinister at work. Meaning it wasn't just a bad teacher, it wasn't just a lazy administrator, it wasn't just a problematic policy, that their kid was not doing well because communism was insinuating itself in local public schools. And so they began to target school teachers and administrators as brainwashers. Now, I focus my work particularly on Southern California as a site of this activity, but it was happening all over the country. And so this starts in about 1952. They imagine themselves as patriotic activists. They're protecting the freedom of the United States. So, all right, where does this fit into Alaska? Because they're not really thinking much about Alaska in Southern California or other major metropolitan centers. But they are thinking about brainwashing. Just as a side note, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1955, that's released. So there are all kinds of ways in which this idea of brainwashing is penetrating American culture and changing the way people actually think about psychology and the relationship between psychology and authoritarianism. One of these things that activists did was they gave talks. No joke. When I first started giving lectures about anti-communist public speakers, I said, like Chautauquas, to help people understand how this information was distributed. It would be someone standing in a room just like this, more often a more intimate setting, where people would hear a lecture. They actually created lecture notes. They did research. They saw themselves as researchers. They would comb legislation. They would comb public health policy. They would go to libraries, partly because these are educated people. Many of these women were college educated, or they had some college experience, but they saw this as part of their job as mothers, as parents, to protect their families. And they had the wealth and the time to do it. So they created these speaker kits. And this is how they kind of spread these ideas about how the federal government, in cooperation with psychiatric professionals, was brainwashing the American public. These are liberals. They would call someone like me a pro-communist or a fellow traveler. And they would say, well, if she, and some of them, I interviewed many of them, and they told me this to my face, that either I knew exactly what I was doing or I was duped somehow, that I was brainwashed. And when I got to know many of them, they wanted to bring me to meetings. They wanted to save me because they still held on to these ideas. So you know what's coming, right? So they're combing this legislation that's coming out of Congress, and they see a bill proposed in 1956. And they're like, why Alaska? Why does Alaska need $5 million and all this acreage for a hospital? That's no hospital. That's a gulag. So the information travels well beyond Southern California because, so I just showed you a copy of the speaker's kit. There weren't Xerox machines in 1956. The way they copied these things was through mimeograph machines. Yeah, some of them had them in their own in garages or whatever. And so they would publish newsletters and they would send them in the mail. And so this is not the internet, but this is kind of like, imagine a network of people all over the country that are, circulating newsletters. They're in touch through their holiday card lists, and they love to reprint legislation and newspaper articles and send them around. So that's how ideas from Southern California spread to Vermont and Florida and Texas. Let me tell you, Houston, Texas, and Dallas, Texas were big centers of this activity as well. So that's how everybody learned about what was called Siberia, USA. because a woman in Southern California, she happened to live in Orange County, wrote an article called Siberia, USA, that it wasn't printed in like major national newspapers, but it was printed in small niche conservative newspapers that were then reprinted and sent. So all of a sudden, Congress is inundated with letters saying, you have to stop this. This is dangerous. You don't understand what you're doing. And of course, the legislators in Alaska, not legislators, pardon me, delegates are like, what is happening? This was just about to be done. We almost had this funding. And they're like, stop, hold the press, something's going on. And so they had a series of hearings. Congress, and so you can read it all about it in the congressional record. That's kind of part of like how I found this article, or this whole story. And women traveled from Southern California to give testimony. And so what's interesting is I have their words about this. And this is what many of them said. Mr. Senator, I don't think you understand what's happening. And why don't you understand? You're so busy that you can't see what's happening right below your nose. I can see it because I'm a woman and I have time and I'm closer to my community, I'm closer to my family, and I see what's happening and you don't. You need to see this. And so it was this moment. And you're never going to guess who broke the logjam. A still relatively new senator from the state of Arizona. Very good. Yeah. Barry Goldwater steps in 1956. Basically because his colleagues and Bob Bartlett said, Barry, what the heck is going on? These are your people. And he's like, I know, this is kind of weird. And what he did was incidental. He just suggested a minor tweak in the language, and I think between his advocacy and whatever tweak he made, that was enough, and it passed. And but it was an interesting moment in what it meant for Alaska as a territory, as this place that was becoming part of the nation, but yet couldn't yet fully integrate itself into the larger American society. All right, so what happens after that? This is an interesting part of the story. I don't want to get into too much detail about it, but one of the arguments that the housewives made was they pointed to the story of Lucille Miller, basically one of them, but she lived in Vermont. This is Lucille with her husband, Manuel, and her 2 children. She was not only an anti-communist, but a rabid anti-Semite. And she published a newspaper that all the Southern California housewives read, like the Texas housewives, called The Green Mountain Rifleman, right? It was not just advocating for gun rights, but it was very anti-Semitic, and it was full of conspiracy theories. She got herself into trouble when she started not just protesting the draft, but she started writing letters to young men in her community and saying, you should not sign up for the draft because it's in violation of the 13th Amendment and blah, blah, blah. And that's against the law, what she did. And so authorities came in and said, look, you have to stop this. She didn't stop this. Long story short, she gets locked up. Partly because when she was fined for doing this, she went right back and said, I demand a jury trial. And that was within her rights. And she said, I don't want representation. I'm going to represent myself. So the prosecutor said, well, she's not fit to present testimony. She needs an examination. So they put her in an institution, in an asylum in Vermont for a month for evaluation. And you know what they said when she came out. You know what the diagnosis is. No, they said she was, this is something else. She was easy to anger. All the things that problematic women present to society, right? She was all the things. So she's not, so they sent her, they put her in a federal psychiatric facility in Washington, D.C. That was after, by the way, a standoff at her house with guns and bombs. It was like Ruby Ridge, because she wouldn't go and her husband wouldn't go. There's another scholar writing about this whole episode, honestly. Anyway, so the California housewives are like, hello, they're coming to get us. You know, they want to lock us up. That's why you should not trust any, they call them mental health professionals. That was their word for anybody who trafficked in psychiatric study. That included guidance counselors at schools, anybody. Okay. More on that in, what is it, July when I come back? Oh, by the way, National Review magazine for conservatives is launching around this time. They make fun of it, these right-wing housewives in California, and they're the ones that developed this cartoon. It's really fuzzy, but that's supposed to be the Bering Strait, where, you know, the communists are sending people back and forth. So the good news is that Alaska becomes a state in 1959, and finally they get a mental health facility in Anchorage by the mid-1960s. And one of the people who came of age in this period was a woman by the name of Karen Purdue. So she was growing up in the 1950s. And she remembered those stories about, are you inside, are you outside, or are you at Morningside? And the reason it kind of always stuck with her is that she had an uncle. His name was Guilford, and I think Guilford Mishka. I believe that her family is Native Alaskan, and she grew up, well, that family came from a village on the Yukon. And when he was still a child, I think he was about 14 years old, this is exactly what happened to him. He was misbehaving. He was becoming a problem for his family. And so the jury was convened and he was sent to Morningside. The problem was, that was the end of the story. Because Karen and the rest of the family never knew what happened after that. And so Karen Purdue grows up in Alaska in the Cold War era, and she herself becomes commissioner of health in Alaska. She becomes a really important political figure, and she's not ready to give up on this story of her uncle. So as she becomes involved in the new psychiatric center, she starts to do research, and she gets a team of people who actually go to Washington, D.C., into the National Archives, and they start digging around. And she said, she walks in, and oh, by the way, her uncle was 14 when this happened. She said she's sitting there, and the staff person at the National Archives pulls out a pile of materials on Morningside Hospital. And so they start going through name after name after name of people. It was on the 7th day when she got the story of her uncle. What happened was he was there for a year at Morningside, then he's released, and he spends the next few decades in and out of institutions. Eventually comes back to Alaska, but he's arrested for stealing a parka because he didn't have any clothes when they sent him back to Alaska. And then he's released, and he dies in an institution, but no one in the family knew that. And it turns out there were many of these stories. So she starts a project. Oh, that's his story. He winds up in the same hospital as Lucille Miller, of the Green Mountain Riflemen. So it's crazy how that place became this weird institution where they just sent people that they didn't know what to do with. So she starts a project called the Lost Alaskans. And it's now a public history program, an effort, a project where people document the stories of Alaskans who essentially disappeared because they were sent to Morningside. And we're talking thousands of people they found. And that's how she got this background that I gave you. When I mentioned the dog sleds and the trips to the port, she is the person who dug up all that information when she first went to the National Archives and started doing this story. This is in the 1980s when she started doing this. So nobody was really talking about the lost Alaskans until that point. And I guess what's really exciting to me is that this is a project that's involved students, like the people I teach. It involves families, the larger public. There's a way in which people are now using the internet to do this kind of crowdsourcing of information about their families, because you can go into the National Archives, or actually you can go online now. If I had connectivity and I wasn't really worried about, the internet right now, I could take you into this site, the Lost Alaskans Patient Database, and you can enter information if you have someone that you know or if you've done any research. But it really started with Karen Perdue and her team. Big surprise. One of the things they found is that the lost Alaskans, overrepresented among them, are indigenous Alaskan people. So, it says Eskimo there, but I'm sure you probably know that's kind of an outdated way of referring to Yupik or Inupiat people who are located more on the coasts of Alaska. So the story has lived on. It's not over. And it really excites me because even as I feel like my profession right now, my field, is very much challenged by the circumstances of the present day, the current political circumstances. I won't go into all the details of the extent to which history departments are closing, historical research is being drained of funding, and we have fewer and fewer majors at American universities who are really studying history and graduating with that degree. At the same time, there is this hunger among the public for history. And there are ways in which non-professionals are finding opportunities to develop skills and to use the internet and these resources to recover important stories even when we historians, the professionals, are not actually writing about it. Nobody, to my knowledge, has written anything at length about the lost Alaskans. The Los Angeles Times had a really great story on the whole project. But this story starts with really Karen Perdue and the Alaskans who decided we need to find our people. We need to figure out what happened to them. It's, of course, part of a larger effort among indigenous Americans to recover the story of Indian schools, right, and the people, their families that were lost, and how those schools, I guess much like this mental health system, really took a hit on their own culture and their own ways of life in their communities, in this case in Alaska. And so I'm hopeful that this project will go further and that more people will develop projects independent of institutions like mine to recover humanity and challenge these larger narratives about what was happening in this period. One slide I didn't want to fail to show you is that almost forgot this part, even though there was no gulag in Alaska, there were camps that never did get talked about in all of this. And these were internment camps during World War II. Now, Native Alaskans who were in the Aleutian Islands were basically relocated to the Inside Passage around Juneau and not far from Sitka because the Japanese attacked the Aleutian Islands. I mean, I don't know how many people know that, but besides, yeah, Hawaii, Alaska was attacked too. This is when Alaska really went on the radar of Eisenhower and the rest of the military. Like, we have to do something with this place. We are very vulnerable. And so they were thinking about the safety of these people, but they were also thinking, we don't want to have to worry about these people on the island, so we're just going to move them. And it was a really tragic moment for the indigenous people, the Aleutian people, who lived in that part of Alaska. But of course, that never entered into discussions about the 1956 Siberia, USA. But it is kind of a sad footnote because it's also the other part of this story is that the way in which mental health is mostly treated today, of course, is through detention, prisons. Most people, or a major percentage of the American population today, receive their mental health as prisoners in our carceral state. So anyway, I hate to leave it on a note like that, but thank you very much. And I hope to see some of you when I return in July to talk about the anti-communist housewives of the 1950s. Thank you.
Hi. Going back to the 50s
Sure.
and conspiracies starting, could you expound a little bit on the John Birch Society and that myriad of billboards out there saying, impeach Earl Warren?
Oh, yeah. So the John Birch Society was established in 1958. And if you wanted to read my book, Mothers of Conservatism, one of the things I write about is how the first John Birch Society meetings were hosted in the homes of these women. And they became not just the hosts, but they would lead the discussions, et cetera. It was a grassroots movement started by a man by the name of Robert Welch in Massachusetts who wanted to fight communism through the methods of the communists. And for him, that was all about study groups and sharing information, but also establishing what he called fronts. So like the idea that communists had their fronts, their false organizations, well, anti-communists should have their fronts. So he convinced a lot of these activists who had already been doing this work since 1952 to basically make their organizations and their newsletters fronts for the John Birch Society. I don't remember if I still have the slide in here. I think I took it out. But one of the other, besides the billboards, because they did argue that Eisenhower was a communist. That was a really unsuccessful campaign on their part, and it made them look like kooks. But they opened what were called John Birch Society bookstores, okay? Well, one of the things that I found, and I have a map in my book, is there were over 28 what they called patriotic bookstores in Los Angeles before the John Birch Society. And so I couldn't prove it outright, but I am convinced, as an observer, that Robert Welch borrowed a lot of ideas from these activist women. He just made it more systematic. So thanks for asking that question.
Yeah, it's incredible your talk, because it really reminds me when I was in Alaska. So anyway, when you talk about inside and outside, inside, it looks like you drew a map based on the weather.
Oh, really?
where it's raining all the time, almost, 10 months out of the year, all the way from Anchorage down to Portland.
Huh.
So that, to me, it looked like inside also has something to do with the climate. But more importantly, what percent of the people that went to Morningside were the native Indians, native Alaskans? And second, is Morningside still there in Portland? And where in Portland is it? Is it still standing?
Okay.
Where is it in Portland, and is it still standing? So what percent
I
of the
don't know
Morningside?
what percentage.
It's
I
greater
bet
than
it could be
50%,
found.
probably?
I don't think it's probably 50%.
Okay.
Because, they were treating a larger population in the contiguous, in Oregon. There is still, I don't know if they call it Morningside, but there is still a facility in Portland, but now they have what's called an Alaskan Health Treatment Program. So Alaska has its own facilities and treatment system and services, but they acknowledge that they still feel remote and cut off. And so the government has funded a program for people who want to come to Portland. So that's part of the legacy, is Portland is still a hub of treatment for people who come from Alaska, but they don't drop off the face of the map the way they used to. I don't remember what it's called now.
Is Morningside facility still there? The building and the
I don't know.
grounds?
Yeah, I got to follow up.
Okay.
Yeah.
I grew up in Northern California, and I remember just even when we would drive home from school, high school, we knew where the John Burt had their meetings. We could say, "Oh yeah, they're having a meeting today," but I was under the impression that most of those guys were men that were going to that John Birch Society meeting. And then after high school, I worked for the Del Monte Corporation in San Francisco. Long story short, but us girls went to work for Del Monte in San Francisco. The guys all took the little Volkswagens and drove up the Alcan Highway, which was terrible at that stage,
Yeah.
working on the boats or in the
Oh.
canneries, because
Yeah.
Del Monte had a lot of canneries up in
Of
Alaska.
course. Yeah.
And at the same time, we were very much aware of how close the Russians were.
Yes.
Because they affected the fishing that as Americans that we were able to do off of Alaska, as opposed to what the Russians were depleting in the fishing fields.
Right.
So
yeah.
we're always aware that they were close. And through the years, it's kind of come about where all of a sudden they put up a warning about the Russians, going into our territory. But it's been going on.
Right,
since
and
the
I failed to
60s.
mention that, is that the Aleutian Islands stretch, practically to Russia, and in fact, before the Cold War, there was this agreement where if you were a member of one of these communities, you could go back and forth between the continents without any interference. That stopped. It was eventually restored, the rights of indigenous people to do that. But it's because, they were so close. They're common languages, common cultures, etc. So thanks for reminding me about that. And the fact that, yes, the John Birch Society included men and women. All of its official leadership was men. But many of the women did, the behind-the-scenes work and kind of the day work of the organization. And the paperwork of the organization and the hosting, etc. Yes.
You may have answered my question, but how is it that Morningside was chosen as the institution to which people were sent?
I think because of the fact that this private hospital probably worked out a deal with Congress and through back channel. It was a hospital that was, let's say, more reachable than other places in the Pacific Northwest, and they got the contract, I guess is the best way to put it, and they were a relatively stable institution that over the years could maintain this particular service to Alaskans. I don't know how the codes were initially chosen, but my guess is that they had good lobbyists.
Going back to the idea of that the
this new institution was going to be a gulag.
Yeah.
You know, so the people found that there was funding for it, but what led them to believe that it was going to be a gulag? Did they have any evidence, or was it just their suspicion?
So this is a great question, because this is how the evidence worked in their minds. They see 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 20, right? So for them, it was too obvious to ignore. You have these Democratic legislators, you have these psychiatric experts, like all the wrong people involved. And then the legislation, as they read it, did not have any protections for people. And you know what's weird is, okay, so one of the things I say in the book is just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean they aren't out to get you, okay? And the case of the St. Elizabeth Hospital in Washington, D.C. is one example. And so, the change to the legislation was basically something put in there to make sure that people were not hospitalized against their will. But in their minds, it created too many opportunities. Second, conspiracy theories were a really effective way for women to broadcast their ideas in the 1950s. Siberia, USA it got attention. And so I asked, so that woman that you saw up there, Marie Koenig, who I got to know very well, I said to her, did you really think there was going to be a gulag in Alaska? She's like, nah. The idea being like, nah, I didn't really believe it, but it was possible, right? And they were evil and blah, blah, blah. So you can see how a conspiracy theory can take hold even if everybody doesn't buy into it hook, line, and sinker. So it says a lot about the dynamics of a conspiracy theory. So thanks for asking that question. Mac.
Yes, the question that I have is, how does Morningside differ from the Texas state, I'm from Texas, from the state hospitals that we developed, that system?
Okay. I'm guessing on the ground, it probably wasn't that different, except it was privately owned and operated by a family. And I don't know the extent to which the Oregon state system for mental health had been developed, let's say, to the same extent as the state of Texas. So I would guess that private institutions probably had way more influence in the 1950s than than they do today, let's say. So, one of the things you're picking up on is how the Alaskan part of the story and the Morningside Hospital part of the story is a way more recent discovery that people are starting to develop and to find out, to get all the information about. And there's still a lot of work to be done.
I noticed you had a picture in the upper right corner of the Scientology thing.
Yes, go ahead, ask your question.
Was the rise of the cults at that time sort of parallel with this?
Yes. So L. Ron Hubbard published Dianetics in 1955 and talked about Siberia, USA, and said in Dianetics and on his talks when he's establishing the Church of Scientology about how America needed Dianetics to make sure that they weren't brainwashed through Siberia, USA. Incidentally, if you go online and you look up Siberia, USA, the conspiracy theory is still in circulation, but it's mostly by Scientologists. And the way they talk about it in the modern day is that it was L. Ron Hubbard who discovered the legislation and the plot, right? This whole part of the history that I told you about from my own research doesn't enter in the equation at all. They'll tell you it was all L. Ron Hubbard who discovered that plot. So thank you. Yes?
My mother was a John Birch housewife.
Oh, wow, where?
In Cleveland here.
Oh.
And I never heard anything about Alaska or these.
Yeah.
And of all the stuff I heard from her and John Birch, Robert Welch
Yeah.
stuff, but my interest in Alaska is about the Alaskan pipeline, which has ties to Cleveland because Standard Oil in Cleveland built that pipeline up there, and a lot of people from Cleveland went up there, and that pipeline, is that sort of the end of its life? Does anybody up in Alaska talk about that pipeline
Wouldn't
being
that be?
decommissioned?
Yeah, that would be a great topic. And the thing is, I don't even know of any historians, environmental historians or historians of capitalism, who have actually written much about the pipeline recently in the story of oil. So if you were my student, I would say get on it. Yeah. But about your mother, so remember, Robert Welch established the JBS in 1958. This all was one and done by 1956. So even though people still talked about mental health, they weren't talking about the Alaska mental health. They weren't talking about Alaska anymore so much. I love that this is happening in Cleveland. I mean, it's happening everywhere. I just happen to focus on LA because it was an epicenter.
Kind of a two-part question. You were saying that at the time, in the 50s, people didn't use the term conservative.
Right.
Compared with now. And I guess I'm wondering maybe two things. One, they probably just called themselves patriots.
Exactly.
Patriots.
Pro-Americans, patriots.
Yeah, and then secondly, seeing parallels to today, it seems like there's a lot of people who say, well, we can't trust the authority.
Yeah.
You know, the whole thing of fake news or alternative news, it seems like there's very strong parallels between, you know, the groups that were coming up with these ideas and then what we see in America today.
Oh, in a big way. You know, so when I was writing this book and, you know, from my dissertation, this is the aughts. Like, I'm writing about this as history. It never crossed my mind that we would be back there. And we're back there in so many ways, full throttle. And probably even more so because of internet and social media makes it possible not only for people to create their own facts and circulate them, but for these fears to spread. And I would argue that today it has more implications for our national healthcare system, for our systems of higher education. I feel like conspiracy theories and fears today have an even greater impact than they did in the 1950s. But what's interesting is how, you know, the way it was talked about and imagined in the 50s was communism. So communism became the catch-all word for so many things that people were afraid of. And that included desegregation, race mixing, Jews, right? Anything that was out of the ordinary was deemed, and there's so many words from back then that are in recirculation today. Outside agitators, right? This idea that if people are coming from one place and bringing ideas to another, that they're dangerous, right? If you're not of a place, then you are held to be suspicious. So what's different today is we don't have that word communism to be the one like big ideology that everybody was afraid of and could shove everything in. So that's why today there's the development of new ideas around critical race theory. What are some of the other ones? Wokeness. Okay, yeah, wokeness. Yeah, exactly. Right, you can put it all in there. Yeah, well, that's the way people imagine and often fall along the spectrum. But in terms of, if you think about conspiracy theories, right, the idea that, you know, people are developing dangerous ideas, it's not surprising that so many of these ideas are focused on institutions of education, right? The idea that teachers are spreading diversity and inclusion ideas that, are dangerous, that critical race theory is seen as dangerous and disruptive. And when you really probe people and ask, well, how is it dangerous? What is it? And they point to how it creates criminal activity. And so back in the 50s and 60s, people would tell you that the reason why you had these racial riots and stuff was because liberal and communists came in and seeded these ideas of rebellion. Not because people were frustrated with segregation and discrimination. It was because liberals came in and spread these ideas. And you have that same, I would say, kind of guilt by association and logic at work again today with conspiracy theories. So.
I was going to ask you how you ended up in Alaska, where you're from, and all that, but it dawned on me there's a bigger question. Since you're a historian and a professor, what happened? Because I had American history in 5th grade, 8th grade, and a junior in high school. I had the history of Canada, Mexico, and Latin America in 6th grade. They taught us about Simon Bolivar and all that. We had world history when I was a sophomore. I mean, what happened? And
so many things.
Why has history been pushed aside? Where did that come from? And even the news, when we were kids, we'd watch Charlie Brinkley or Walter Cronkite. We knew who the Prime Minister of Canada was, the President of France, the Prime Minister of England, because it was on the news all the time. So it's really world news. But now you don't see anything like that. So what happened to history?
Well, many things happen, and I'm sure many of you have ideas that you could contribute to this conversation. But one of them, and I see this through the education of my own child, is the emphasis away from history and subjects towards math and reading, and to put everything into those categories under I would say, the commitment to making students more proficient in those core areas. Students still have to learn American history in 7th grade and in 11th grade. And I know that because I'm sometimes consulted on textbooks, which is, of course, its own juggernaut. And so people, McGraw-Hill is still making lots of money over the teaching of American history. And if you are in California, I think you still have to learn California history. Probably in Texas, I'm sure you have to learn Texas history. And so it really does depend on what you are. But the other problem is, the withdrawal and outright clawback of funding for research in these areas in teaching. And another big problem is the cost of higher education. So if you have to pay $100,000 to send your kid to college, you want them to have a degree that's going to get them a job. And so a lot of kids, understandingly, come in and they don't want to major in history because they don't want to have to go after another degree. They want to major in something that's going to get them a job. So that's why the number of majors has constricted, and therefore universities are shutting history departments altogether. And then add that to the fact that all of the institutions that used to fund state institutions that would fund historical research have withdrawn all that money. So it's kind of like a cascading series of events. And a lot of people in the profession are despairing, but we're not alone. People who study classics, people who study languages, all kinds of subjects are falling under the axe. But I don't know, call me Pollyannish. I'm really hopeful for the humanities right now, in the sense that I feel like I see people kind of waking up and seeing the value of this kind of education as a way of kind of distinguishing human thinking from artificial intelligence, and as a way of training our next generation and how to deal with the technology that's assaulting them. Thanks for asking that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your questions.